Kate Moran is associate professor in the philosophy department at Brandeis University. And Kate works especially on Kant's moral and legal philosophy, and is also interested in the history of philosophy, obviously, and contemporary ethical theory. She has published, among many other things, the book Community and Progress in Kant's Moral Philosophy, 2012. And I just pick out two of her articles, Neither Justice Nor Charity, Kant on General Injustice in the Canadian Journal of Philosophy, 2017. And the most recent paper, Kant on Traveling Blacksmiths and Passive Citizenship in Kant-Studien, 2021. Kate, it's my pleasure to have you here, and it's your floor.
Thank you very much. And thank you everyone for both to the organizers for putting this together and so many other events, and everyone for being here. I'm going to share my screen. I have some slides. I have worked on Kant's philosophy of education in the past as pedagogy. This particular topic is one that I've really just recently started thinking about, in particular, the question of how common sense plays a role in Kant's pedagogy, and to what extent Kant's pedagogy or his ideas about the ideal sort of pedagogy inform his theory of common sense or vice versa. I know Martin Sticker has worked a lot on common sense, and so I'm very excited to hear what people have to say in the Q&A period. So the sort of setup or the problem of the paper, or the question, not really problem, the question that the paper explores is as follows. It strikes me that Kant appeals to common sense both when he's addressing adult audiences, and I'll talk in the first part of the paper about some of the major places where common sense plays a role in an argument or in an example to give extra evidence for an argument. But then he also appeals to common sense in the context of pedagogy and education. So he's appealing to, in a couple of cases that we'll look at, he sort of gives examples of how you would talk to a child about morality. And in both of those cases, there's some appeal to what they take for granted or what is for them common sense. So that's interesting, because I think we've all been children. Some of us know children. What's common sense to children may not be what's common sense to adults. It's already a bit of a question how Kant understands common sense or common rationality when it comes to adults. So there's a few questions that we can ask. This is not in a, a complete list probably, but some that dawn on me. How does common sense develop? Does it develop? Is it the kind of thing that emerges, or is it the kind of thing that gets perfected and worked upon? Is it monolithic? Are there parts to it? Are there aspects to it? Is it one thing that develops and gets practiced, for example, in judgment, or are there elements or aspects to it that sort of come online, as it were, at different stages in development? And can it be distorted, for example, through a bad education or, say, neglect in childhood? Is it common sense the kind of thing that, even though Kant will appeal to it in various arguments, it could be distorted or somehow damaged in education? So these are some of the questions I'll sort of try to answer along the way. And I think the discussion helps us in two separate regards. So I'm going to sort of take a look at the appeals to common sense that are addressed to adults and those that are addressed to children, to see if we can pick up any themes in both and see how Kant thinks maybe common sense develops. My hope is that this accomplishes two goals. One is sort of some further help in our understanding of Kant's pedagogical theory. People who've done some work on Kant's pedagogy know that some of the sources are more reliable than others. The On Pedagogy text is highly edited by Rink and not always maybe reliable. So I think to the extent that we can glean some conclusions about Kant's theory of childhood, theory of children, theories of what what children know as a matter of common sense out of his published texts, that is helpful when it comes to understanding his pedagogical theory and his theory, as it were, of childhood. It's also, I think, obviously helpful to understand this just when we're trying to understand what Kant has in mind when he's talking about common human reason and common sense. So I'm going to start by looking at some of the points in Kant's moral arguments where common sense plays a role. These are going to be the cases that are addressed presumably at adult audiences who are reading his books. And then I'll take a look at two key passages in which, in the published texts, where Kant is giving an example of an educator appealing to something like common sense in the pupil. You'll probably be able to guess that this is the passage, the sort of Anne Boleyn passage in the Critique of Practical Reason and the Moral Catechism in the Doctrine of Virtue. And then I'll develop some preliminary theses about common sense in children and how this develops or fails to over the course of education. Okay, so what I'm going to do for the next few slides is just sort of look at areas of inquiry or sort of premises, I guess, in Kant's arguments where common sense plays a role in establishing a premise or part of the argument. So I take it that it's something like a matter of common sense for Kant that the moral law is necessary and universal. So this is from the preface of the groundwork. So Kant says in the second sentence here, for that there must be such, that is a moral philosophy cleansed of everything that may be empirical, for that there must be such is itself clear from the common idea of duty and of moral laws. Everyone must admit that a law, if it is to hold morally, i.e. as a ground of obligation, must carry it with an absolute necessity. And he goes on, and what comes after the semicolon at the end of this is the claim that morality has to be based in pure rational concepts. And so I don't take that to be a matter of common sense, but I take it almost to be a sort of verging on an analytic definitional claim here for him that a moral law is the kind of thing that's necessary. But it's interesting, I think, that he appeals to the common idea of duty and of moral law. So he doesn't say everyone has to admit that if you look at the definition of a law, right? He sort of is also appealing to the common idea of lawfulness. Okay, so that's, I think, one sort of very foundational point where Kant thinks this is just kind of a matter of common sense. The big one, I think, and I'll devote the next two slides to this, is something having to do with judging moral worth, worthiness to be happy, sort of pureness, sort of purity of motivation. So this is actually, this passage, which is one of my favorites. I'll say why in a second. This comes just before the Anne Boleyn passage in the Critique of Practical Reason. And, you know, here Kant notices that, you know, even business people or women like to tell stories and joke and, you know, but they also really like to talk about the moral worth of other people's actions. And it, you know, brings a liveliness to company when we start having arguments about the moral worth of this or that action. I think this, you know, I guess this bears out. People really love, I mean, there are various online forums where you can talk about whether people are jerks or not, to use a polite word. And so Kant, I think, you know, he's picking up on this thing that we at least really enjoy talking about the moral worth of people's actions. So it's something that we like to do. And then part two, of course, is it's something that we have some kind of common sense ability to engage in, for better or for worse. I think this can misfire. I'll say something about that in a second. But, you know, if we look at the structure of the argument in the first section of the groundwork, it's clear that the sort of first proposition that's leading us to the sort of outline of the categorical imperative has to do with it being sort of a matter of common sense, once you sort of really think about it for a minute, that moral worth has to be non-contingently motivated. And so Kant says, before he starts engaging in the examination of moral worth, and the 4 types of action there in the groundwork, that what he wants to do is to sort of unravel this concept of a good will, which he thinks already dwells in a natural sound understanding, which needs not so much to be taught as just brought to light, right? So that's an interesting clue, I guess, also with respect to the examination of pedagogy. I mean, I think there's a word of caution, though, here also that's merited, and that is that it does seem to be a matter of common human reason to sort of deploy this ability, but I think we need to be careful how we do it. And I'll come back to this when I talk about children and pedagogy as well. It's clear that assessing the worth of others' actions or others' maxims can be a useful philosophical tool. It's clear from the passage we just looked at about business people and women that it can be fun sometimes or enjoyable. It can be kind of skill that we practice in doing that kind of judging. But in practice, it's really a tool that we should apply more to ourselves. I think that there is actually a way we can go wrong overemphasizing an examination of other people's moral worth and under examining our own, or where we may be falling short. So it's an interesting kind of tension there, how this skill is developed and used, I think, as children grow up into adults. So those are 2 sort of domains, I think, of common sense. The third domain is that of justice and moral desert. So this has to a large extent be bound up with the previous sort of domain or element of common sense, which is moral worth. And so, you know, that's largely a judgment of worthiness to be happy. But I'm thinking in particular of passages like this one in the religion. You know, it cannot possibly be a matter of indifference to reason how to answer the question, what's the result of this right conduct of ours? I think a lot of times when he argues about the highest good, there's a sense in which we cannot help. Common human reason cannot help but demand an answer to this kind of question, either in our own case or at least in the case of sort of with respect to the moral community and progress in history. Okay, and number 4, also a big one, freedom and the possibility of morality, so the deduction of the moral law in the 3rd section of the groundwork and in the critique of practical reason. Of course, I won't read the gallows passage because we all have it memorized. I always tell my students, you know, the things you learn in Kant school, like the analytic synthetic chart that you draw on the board. So this is one I think that we can just sort of, you know, all consider together. But, you know, this is, you know, a classic example of Kant appealing to something like common human reason to give the deduction of freedom and the moral law. And of course, it also exists maybe in a sort of more nascent sense in the 3rd section of the groundwork, the scoundrel. There's no one, not even the most hardened scoundrel, if he's otherwise in the habit of using reason, who one presents him with examples of probity and purpose, steadfastness in following good maxims, and of general benevolence, does not wish that he too might be so disposed. Okay, a little caveat there, of course. I think there's a sense in which Kant would probably say that sort of mere common sense, your sort of real common sense, probably might not even pose the sort of question in the first place, the sort of, okay, does it apply to me? How do we know that the moral law exists and applies to me, obligates me? So maybe this is common sense answering a question that only a philosopher would ask, but I think in any case, is clearly a place where common sense plays a role in some of the arguments, and maybe controversially so. Okay, so I'm going to now turn to Kant's discussions of pedagogy. I'm going to start with the Catechism in the Doctrine of Virtue. because there's a line in the Critique of Practical Reason in the dialogue, or the Anne Boleyn example, where Kant says that these examples should only sort of be used or deployed once the student or the pupil has sort of gone through the moral catechism. So I'll take him at his word and assume that this is primary, that this kind of dialogue is primary. I have to say, I don't know what to make of this passage. I sometimes think it's a little bit artificial, a little bit, I sort of scratch my head and wonder if it would really go down like this. But then again, there are some parts where I can sort of see his point. And it's clear that, which I think that struck me as interesting when I started looking at these passages, it's clear that Kant thinks that the necessity, so the first point about necessity and universality, is presumably there for children already, right? So Kant sort of poses a sort of, harmful lie example, right? Suppose, for example, a situation arises in which you could get a great benefit for yourself or your friend by making up a subtle lie that would harm no one. What does your reason say about this? Now, of course, Kant, it doesn't think in the Catechism that this is a sort of a Socratic dialogue. He thinks that children are not sufficiently morally developed to sort of be able to pose questions that get us anywhere. So he doesn't think they're sophisticated moral reasoners in that sense, but he does think of it as sort of drawing out things that are already sort of nascently, the children nascently aware of, or that are sort of exist, if only dimly, in their reason. So I'm going to sort of take it for granted that he thinks that this is something that the child can give a response to. The pupil dutifully replies, I ought not to lie, no matter how great the benefits to myself and my friend by me. Lying is mean and makes being unworthy of happiness. I'll come back to that in a second. Here is an unconditional necessitation through a command, a prohibition of reason. I really doubt he'd say this, but which I must obey in the face of all my inclinations, must be silent. So I think my initial reaction to this is to sort of say, yeah, oh right, okay. But then when I think about it a little bit, I have to say, I think one thing that children are very good at noticing is when laws or rules are applied differently to different people. So even though I think this may be a little bit artificial, a little bit forced for Kant's rhetorical purposes here, he may not be terribly far off. I mean, that might be sort of halfway plausible, that children are pretty good at recognizing that a rule is the kind of thing that applies to everybody. A moral law is the kind of thing that applies across the board. And insofar as somebody is getting special treatment or making an exception for themselves on the basis of what they want, then that's going to be not really a law. So maybe I'll give Kant more credit for this than I initially thought I would. Notice also the other bit of this passage I've highlighted in red. The pupil says lying is mean and makes a human being unworthy of happiness. Kant appears to think that a pupil would would be able to make judgments about moral worth and desert, right? Also, I think something that's maybe not terribly implausible. I mean, I don't know if a child would put it necessarily in these hyper Kantian terms, but I think it's not implausible to think that a child might be able to see that there's something wrong with a peer or a person getting ahead because they've violated the moral law or done something wrong. I'm interested to hear what people think in discussion. The great example of sort of worthiness to be happy and moral worth in the moral catechism is maybe I'm doing all my favorite passages here, the lazy person pillow passage, right? The teacher says, would you give a lazy fellow a soft cushion so he can pass his life away in sweet idleness? Would you see to it that a drunkard is never short of wine and whatever else he needs to get drunk, et cetera, et cetera? Would you give him money? And then, the pupil says, no, of course I wouldn't do these things. And the fascinating thing, I won't go through it here, but the fascinating thing about this fragment of the moral catechism is that Kant feels so secure that the pupil has this like really deep understanding of moral worth and worthiness to be happy, that he gets him all the way to something like a transcendental argument for belief in God, right? He sort of says, aha, so you see, so you think that, you know, if you're moral, you ought to sort of have some happiness, and is nature going to do that for you? And the pupil says, no. He says, well, then what does that make you realize? And the pupil says, oh, that I ought to believe in God, as you know, and it's like, well, okay. Some of us took that argument to be very difficult, but Kant apparently thinks that even a child can sort of see the sort of forming of that transcendental argument for God's existence. So that seems to be something Kant thinks is there. So I'll move on to the Anne Boleyn passage. Again, this comes after Kant's sort of observation that people enjoy talking about examples, people enjoy talking about the moral worth in historical cases. What's, I think, interesting about the Anne Boleyn passage, when I first started thinking about comparing these discussions, is that the setup of the passage is very similar to the gallows case, right? So Kant thinks we should sort of appeal to these historical examples. You can tell the pupil a story about a person, an innocent person who at first is sort of offered rewards, and then, you know, slowly things get taken away, and then, you know, and the person refuses to do something that violates the moral law. It's clear that Kant is not using this example, even though the setup is similar to the gallows case. He's not using it to sort of elicit in the child any kind of sense of their own freedom or anything. It's really something closer to what's going on with for example, the beneficent agent in the first section of the groundwork, whose life, who's, you know, gloomy and acts only out of duty. He thinks that this example is set up to activate the pupil's appraisal in marking the lesser or greater moral import of action. So what we're doing with if historical examples like the Anne Boleyn case is instilling them an appreciation for these examples in which a person, despite contrary inclination, or despite, you know, promised pain and suffering, rises above their sensibility and acts according to the moral law. Kant thinks the listener will be raised step by step from mere approval to admiration, from that to amazement, and finally to the greatest veneration and a lively wish that he himself could be such a man, though certainly not in such circumstances. And yet virtue is here worth so much only because it costs so much, not because it brings any profit. All the admiration, even the endeavor to resemble this character here, rests wholly on the purity of the moral principle, which can be clearly represented only if one removes the incentive to action, everything from the incentive, everything that people may reckon only to happiness. So Kant is very clear that these examples have to be sort of used such that you really sort of isolate the moral law, you let it, you know, to use his metaphor, shine sort of like a jewel, and this raises the child from admiration to amazement and then to veneration. And then what I really want to sort of point out here is this wish that he himself could be such a man, if not in those circumstances. So that leads me, so these passages lead me to think this is a very provisional sort of account of the developmental sort of stages of common sense. I take it he thinks there's a couple of things in place from a very young age. Okay, so we're not talking, you know, we're not talking about babies and whatever, but at the point at which you're able to engage in some kind of moral catechistic dialogue with a pupil, in place is some capacity to judge moral worth. Third, personally, I think this is really crucial to the account, including a very strong sense of sort of rule following, or like the lawfulness, universality of rules, and a strong sense of justice, desert, and a worthiness to be happy. That appears to be there in the catechism. He seems to take that for granted, right? So we have a third personal capacity to judge. So by that I mean other people's the moral worth of other people's maxims or actions, a strong sense of justice, and a sense that morality is the kind of thing that is necessary and universal. I think something that follows immediately upon that is a kind of habituation and fine-tuning of judgment, especially, and I didn't talk about them much here, but especially via casuistical questions, like those in the doctrine of virtue. So once you sort of have the pupil at the stage where they're sort of recognizing moral worth, and you can sort of give harder questions and you sort of habituate and fine-tune this judgment. And Kant thinks in the passage I think I'll show on the next slide, there's something to this also that's important with respect to the next step, this kind of first personal turn, I think. So one of the things that I think is really interesting about the way that these appeals to common sense are used in the cases of adults is that they're very often addressed at the adult thinking about their own, how they would act and what their duty would be. So, I mean, the gallows case was a really good example of this. The scoundrel passage is a really good example of this. And the pedagogical cases are more often sort of a third personal thing where you're looking at examples where you're sort of appealing to their capacity to judge these third personal cases. So I do think one thing that's going on in the pedagogy is that he's encouraging, or Kant thinks that pedagogy can encourage this first personal turn, right? That you sort of encourage the pupil to, as the previous passage kind of indicated, move from approval and admiration to amazement, and then finally this kind of wish that you could be like that, right? So that there's this kind of turning it inward and thinking of oneself as an agent in these situations. And of course, Kant also thinks, to go back to point 2 about habituation and fine-tuning of judgment, that engaging in this kind of inquiry, in this kinds of, thinking about casuistical questions and sharpening judgment is the kind of thing that will also allow the pupil to sort of come to love morality, like the sort of thinking about morality and doing morality, thinking about it, which is also, I think, part of that first personal turn. And then finally, a kind of reverence or respect for the moral law. So I think that's also bound up in these passages about sort of instilling awe and amazement. That's part of, I think, what moral pedagogy is meant to do. Oops. And yeah, this is the passage where Kant sort of talks about practicing. So I'll sort of have these next passages go sort of talk about some of these stages. So this is a passage where Kant, let me just take a look at the time. This is a passage where Kant sort of talks about, the kind of habituation, practicing one's judgment. So Kant thinks that, you can turn this into a game, and he thinks it'll leave behind a lasting impression of esteem on the one hand, disgust on the other. So you are sort of also encouraging reverence or esteem for the moral law. This inward turn, this passage, this is from the Doctrine of Virtue. I will just, since I think I don't want to go too far into the Q&A period, I'll read the parts that I've highlighted. Kant says, you do this, we sort of engage in this moral catechism, then he says that there's something that has to come at the end. And this is, I think, an indication about this sort of inward turn. He says, which moves the soul inwardly and puts him in a position where he can look upon himself with the greatest wonder at the original predisposition dwelling within him. What is it in you that can be trusted to enter into combat with all the forces of nature within you and around you, to conquer them if they come into conflict with your moral principles? So again, I think there's this encouragement of sort of recognizing this capacity in oneself, and then also kind of developing kind of reverence or esteem for it. By way of conclusion, and I think this is also an interesting twist, and also I think further support for some of these developmental stages, I think there's a clear way in which each step can go badly wrong. in Kant's view. So when it comes to the stage of habituation and fine-tuning, Kant clearly thinks we can develop faulty habits of judgment and blind spots. Thomas mentioned my paper on general injustice. I think this is a clear example of it. Then the footnote just to that passage. So the footnote about, there's one footnote about this general injustice phenomenon that occurs in this passage where Kant says, we tend to congratulate ourselves for being charitable and beneficent, even though what we're doing actually is just rectifying a past injustice. And that footnote about general injustice and sort of making these faulty judgments because we don't recognize past injustice, that occurs in this Anne Boleyn discussion, right? So I think what Kant is sort of saying is you have to be careful when you're fine-tuning judgment that you sort of go about it in the right way. Otherwise, you can, unsurprisingly, develop, solidify faulty habits of judgment and blind spots like the one surrounding general injustice. The first personal turn, so this turn, thinking about, gosh, it's not just other people who are sort of, whose moral worth I can judge according to the moral law, but it's also my own. Obviously, it can be incomplete, self-deceiving, tend towards self-congratulation. If the first personal turn is incomplete, then I think you run the risk of doing precisely what Kant wants you not to be doing when it comes to making judgments of moral worth, and that is thinking too much about other people's worth and not enough about your own. So that first personal turn, I think, is really important for the development of these capacities in pedagogy. And of course, respect and reverence. Kant thinks this is why he says you can't, appeal to mere heroes of romance. You can't appeal to impossible examples. These sort of what we might call like supererogatory or heroic, impossible deeds. When you're teaching children about examples or using examples to teach children, because this can result in a kind of fanaticism where you lose sight of the moral law, the principle, and you sort of instead focus on these, glowing examples of heroism and how wonderful and noble and, kind these deeds are. And you sort of develop this sense that also, I think a problem with fanaticism is you develop a sense that there's a certain type of person, a hero of romance who does those things, but the rest of us don't. There's a sense in which it kind of diminishes students or pupils' real respect for the moral law within themselves because they sort of think morality is the thing that those people do, not me. So I think it's interesting that if you sort of look at these sort of various stages, habituation, the fine-tuning of judgment, the sort of first personal turn, and then also the development of a kind of reverence and respect for the moral law within oneself. I think there's a way that those can all really go badly wrong. And I think probably one of the important tasks of Kant's pedagogy is to not just encourage the development of these things, but sort of discourage the bad development or them developing in the wrong way. So I will end there and thank you very much. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Kate. That was very inspiring. I have a couple of questions myself, of course, but I would like to encourage everyone else to talk up first, and particularly our junior group members as well, if they want to. So I did not exactly notice who went first up, but Martin's hand is still up. So Martin, you get the first shot.
Yeah, hey, Kate, thanks. That was great. Yes, I liked it a lot, and I'm actually still working on this book project on common human reason, where I do say more about common agents, also children. So firstly, please, if you have paper form of this, do send it to me. Be really interested to read this. I have a bunch of things that interest me, but maybe the one that I find currently most interesting is the question, do you think there's room in Kant for education going very differently, but not badly wrong? For instance, if Peter Singer educates, right? He would try to instill very different values than a Kantian, or at least partly different values. Would Kant have to say that this means education is going wrong? Another example could be the South Sea Islanders in the groundwork, right? They seem to have partly a different idea of what their duty is. They don't seem to think that they have a duty to perfect their talents, right? But it might well be that they have a perfectly functional idea of morality that structures their society. Is their education going wrong? So I'm basically interested in a way, is the progression of steps that you present, is that necessary? And is it necessarily the rational step or the rational progression, or could it go differently? And I suspect that we can instill very different values in children, and maybe some of these might be perfectly valid.
Yeah. I mean, I think, so I think Kant needs to be committed to the view that you don't need an official moral education in order to develop into a moral agent, because that would be a very strange twist and very problematic twist. I mean, my view has been, I think, in writing about these things, that Kant thinks that sort of being in society with other human beings, especially if you enjoy talking about moral worth and such things, but also sort of understanding that they impose limits on your actions and how to sort of, negotiate those conflicts, will serve as some sort of education. So I've always taken Kant's suggestions about pedagogy to be suggestions sort of how to perfect something, how to catalyze something, how to steer clear from maybe pitfalls, or just sort of really kind of like an encouraging boost, I think you might give to development of agents. I mean, it's interesting to sort of think, one way I think you could sort of approach the question that you've asked is sort of to think about, okay, in what ways could it do more harm than good, right? So, I mean, I think Kant sort of committed to the view, like I was saying, that if you sort of leave people alone in society, their common human reason will develop to a point where, they'll sort of see these things about necessity and moral worth. Look, I mean, it's clear that you could, I suppose, educate or inculcate really horrible values onto children, like, evil ones. But I think that's not really your question. Your question is, could you sort of educate them to one of the sort of, other moral principles that Kant sort of dismisses as heteronymous, for example, at the end of the second section of the groundwork. So, I mean, there, I guess I would say I'm just sort of thinking off the top of my head, it seems like the danger that can emerge in the context of education, the ones that he really wants people to avoid are these ones having to do with self-congratulation, enthusiasm, sort of thinking of oneself as exceptionally perfect, or somehow, thinking of morality as kind of thing that's like a domain of sort of, these heroes of romance. So you might think, okay, if you educate a child to be a utilitarian, so if Peter Singer does the moral education, then you might be sort of giving them, on the Kantian view, a kind of wrong idea about the grounds of morality, right? And you might, be sort of giving them some sort of faulty views about sort of the necessity of the moral law and it being based on things that aren't contingent, all that kind of stuff. But you're not, if you do that, I don't think there's any danger, if Peter Singer is doing the lesson, that the child is going to be letting themselves off the hook too easily, or that they're going to be congratulating themselves for being such a wonderfully moral person. So I think, so maybe one way of answering the question, it's an interesting question, I haven't thought about it much, is just that you could sort of parcel out these sort of various aspects or domains of moral education and say, okay, some forms of moral education could be really harmful because they make the child think that they sort of develop enthusiasm and fanaticism. Whereas some, even though they might have the sort of details of the moral principle wrong, the sort of grounding of morality wrong, at least they sort of still encourage this kind of rigorous thinking about one's own duties and sort of being honest with oneself in that respect.
Okay, Andrea Kern is next on my list, and I add to that what I've written in the chat. If you're not familiar with using, or if your machine doesn't allow you to use the hand symbol, just write the word hand in the chat function, or make yourself noticed somehow if that doesn't work either. Andrea, please.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So I want to make a comment on the catechistic Kant, because you asked what we think about it. And I find the catechistic Kant more insane than you seem to think he is. Because I mean, just for the simple reason that the kind of conversation has an inner paradox, because either the conversation goes well and we get the right answer, so but then it was superfluous about talking about lying, or we get the wrong answer, but then telling the student the right answer is not making any progress in moral education. So that's why I think this catechistic conversation is insane. But so my question to you is that do you think, let's say moral education is about education for being good, education for having the moral capacity, and we try to figure out what that means and in how these are related to each other. And the way in which you described moral education, to me it sounded like it does. It's formally very similar and close to what it means to acquire just any skill or capacity at all. So that the difference between acquiring the capacity to play the piano and acquiring the capacity to be a morally good person, the main difference is more in the content of the capacity, but the difference between morality and playing the piano is not, so to say, reflected in their education. It seems to me that the steps that you described, it's so we start third personally, so look, this is playing the piano, so this is da-da-da, and then we go fine-tuning the judgment about so how to play, and then of course now you do it yourself and do it first personally and whatever. So it seems to me the way in which you describe it, it's yeah. So and I just want to ask, is that the way as you see it? So it's just a capacity, although it's the most important, whatever, but there's.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think to an extent that may be right, with the exception perhaps of the sort of last step of sort of reverence, or kind of, I think that the passage in which Kant says they'll sort of be led sort of to recognize this thing inside of them that has this ability to withstand inclination for the sake of what's right. I think that may be something slightly different than sort of learning a skill, internalizing it and applying it. I think that's a kind of reflection on, and who knows, maybe that's also, well, but I was gonna say maybe that's also part of sort of learning something like playing the piano, but sort of, I think there's a moment of reflecting on this ability, which of course for Kant is a very special ability, and sort of developing this kind of reverence for the moral law within oneself. So I think that it may not be totally wrong to think that the initial stages at least are very similar to learning something, with the added step of sort of developing this kind of reverence or awe. as the final stage. One question I had, I don't know if anybody in the audience knows this, knows sort of a passage where I could look for this. But one thing I was sort of wondering as I was working on this is whether he has anything comparable in sort of discussing development of judgments of taste. So I don't know if there's a sort of aesthetic education that may run parallel to this or something for Kant. That might be also an interesting sort of parallel. The piano playing reminded me of that. But yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, but the major difference has to be this kind of reverence for this sort of necessity and ability to be sort of spontaneous and self-guiding. But
good. If no other hand is up, then I will ask my question. One way in which one can see a large chunk of your talk is by saying that so much for the historical myth of early modern individualism. The demand to think for oneself is like guided through this notion of common sense or common human reason, which is tightly connected to the view that one can know the answers when one thinks for oneself only by putting oneself in the shoes of others to this third personal perspective. That's a strong thing. But I'm wondering what you think about the relation between the notion of common sense, Gemeinsinn in German, and that comes from the Latin sensus communis, and the notion of reason, because sense normally is like an indicator, and Kant, there are passages actually in the Anthropology where Kant speaks of sensus communis, Gemeinsinn, as the lowest cognitive faculty. Which would be in a sense good, because it would be a possible answer to the question that Martin raised, which I find interesting. If there is only a minimal cognitive ability that is shared by all human beings, then that problem doesn't show up. Of course, it doesn't guarantee that we will get certain moral answers the way that we want them to be, but there might be a minimum overlapping consensus, so to speak. Yeah. So what is the relation between sensus communis in this sense and proper practical reason, which sometimes seems to equate, right?
Yeah, that's a nice question. I think the sensus communis thing makes me also think of another thing that Kant will sometimes say about education, which I think is very telling, and that is that it has to be public, as it were, right? That there's something really important, not publicly funded, but there's something really important about putting children in groups of other children or around other people, and sort of letting them have that experience of sort of seeing, sometimes they'll sort of talk about sort of like the initial stages of education. So we're talking about sort of infants and toddlers. And I think he's maybe cribbing a lot from Rousseau here, but they're sort of to feel your own freedom, to feel your own agency, to sort of have a sense that you're an agent. Then you put these children in a group with other children, and they'll recognize that they're not the only ones with wills and agencies and things. And so I guess my thought there is that's when sort of pure practical reason comes into play, right? And this may be sort of a bit of an artificial setup, but I guess I think my thinking is that it's sort of the moment at which we sort of have to think of how to organize our wills, or sort of where one will starts and another stops, that practical reason, pure practical reason comes into play, or it becomes sort of an issue for kids. So
there's a weak notion of Gemeinsinn in some passages in Kant, where the only thing that it excludes is what Kant calls logischer Eigensinn, sensus. I think that's translated as logical private sense. But the Latin, again, this comes also from older Latin texts, probably Baumgarten and so on. There is a sensus communis, and then there is a sensus privatus. That can be logical and practical and aesthetic, each of those two. Right? And that is a very weak or moderate notion of Gemeinsinn. And then you could imagine that Kant successively enriches it until it becomes practical reason. And that could or could not mirror stages of human cognitive and psychosocial development. Would that be what Kant wants to say?
Not knowing all of the sort of references to Gemeinsinn, it could be that the word is sort of being used in slightly different ways. But I do think that there is this, I do think that there is a sense in which however we want to sort of describe this development, right? It's a development that I think does emerge, and I think this is the point about sort of public education, in sort of the realization that your will and your desires are not it, right? That how about we put it this way? I think that when Kant talks about it being important that sort of children be educated in groups with other children and come encounter, it's the first time the problem is posed for them. And of course, children are accustomed to having their wills thwarted, but in a kind of authoritarian way, right? So like you have parents who tell you, you can't touch that, or you can't, that'll hurt you, right? And that's just kind of like, no, you can't. That's just kind of a limitation on your will. But I think there's, and I'm sort of speculating here a little bit, but I think there is something about sort of the move toward putting children in groups with sort of what we might sort of say are equals, where you sort of pose the problem, right? Okay, now we have this problem where there's no kind of parental authoritarian sort of will saying what you can and can't do, but we have a bunch of sort of equally situated wills wanting things that don't correspond with each other. And now the problem is posed, how do we deal with that? Which may sort of correspond with what you're saying, right? This sort of starting to think not just merely in terms of what my more sort of personally centered, egocentric sort of thinking, but sort of disposing the problem in the first place. Yeah.
Thank you. Paul Kohr has been waiting patiently, and then Peter Baumann and David Beckers, and a reminder is all that we have 10 minutes left for the three. So 3 minutes each for answering and for question and answer, please. Paul Kohr. If Paul is not currently available, then I take Peter Baumann next, and Paul when he is available.
Okay, thank you. There are these very critical remarks of Kant in the preface to the Prolegomena, for instance, when it comes to theoretical reason, but it seems that such remarks are missing when it comes to practical philosophy. One explanation would be that in his theoretical philosophy, he's worried about the epistemic skeptic, Hume and others, whereas in his moral philosophy, he isn't really taking the moral skeptic very seriously. So I wonder whether that would be your explanation. And also, is there any place, can you see any passage where Kant, when he talks about moral education, mentions the moral skeptic, or is the moral skeptic there completely absent? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. No, I think your hunch is right. I don't think not that I'm aware of, that he does. Kant thinks that, of course, the bad tendencies in theoretical and practical reason are very different. Theoretical reason has this tendency to want to ask questions it can't answer. And so to an extent, some form of skepticism is actually appropriate in theoretical philosophy, not, but, a sense in which you sort of recognize your boundaries. I think and Martin Sticker has written a lot about sort of self-deception and things, but I think the tendency of practical reason, pure practical reason, is not to ask questions it can't answer, but to try to find ways out of being bound by recognizing a duty that it does in fact recognize that it has. So the real sort of bad tendency, if you can sort of think of bad habits of theoretical reason and bad habits of practical reason, the bad habits of theoretical reason are habits of overstepping, tendencies to, you know, get out over your skis, as it were, when it comes to sort of asking these theoretical questions. Yeah, I mean, I think Kant's view is that, you know, there's no sense in which you sort of are going beyond the limits of anything in practical reason, or pure practical reason, but there is a sense in which once you recognize what your duties are, there's a tendency toward rationalization, insofar as there's a skeptical tendency in the moral philosophy. I think it's in the service of inclination and sensibility, right? There's a tendency to sort of think, okay, well, one way I might be able to get out of, there's a very sophisticated double think, right? One way I might be able to get out of these obligations that I have is to question the validity of the moral law or its applicability, at least to me in this particular circumstance. But I think you're right. I don't think that Kant is really worried about the amoralist or the skeptic in his moral philosophy, the way other philosophers might be. I think he thinks that's just a, you know, sometimes, you know, when I sort of teach this stuff, I sort of think like, if you agreed with Kant in the preface that morality is the sort of thing that is necessary and universal, I think Kant thinks he's got you, right? Like, then that, you know, you get off the bus there or you're on for the whole ride, I think, for Kant. So yeah, I mean, that's interesting. And that goes back to Andrea's question, which is sort of like, what does Kant have to say to the child or the pupil who sort of says, oh yeah, really? That's just, you know, that's your moral law. That's not my moral law. I mean, I do think children do have a tendency to sort of recognize injustice and recognize when exceptions are being made inappropriately. They probably also have a tendency to sort of ask those kinds of skeptical questions, maybe more than Kant wants to admit. So yeah, both of those are interesting points.
If Paul Koa is still not available, or are you, Paul, then I will take David. David?
Yeah, hi, thanks. Thanks very much, Kate, for a great talk. I just wanted to ask about the relation between the Kantian concept of Gemeinsinn and term common sense as it's typically used in English, because sometimes it seems like it's very much, we're talking about the same thing, and sometimes Gemeinsinn seems to be quite a technical notion, the notion of common human reason as a faculty, as Thomas was saying, like your sort of bottom level cognitive faculty. And then it seems rather different from the English notion of sort of sound judgment in practical reasoning, and the sorts of things philosophers, 20th century British philosophers would appeal to when they were talking about appeals to common sense. They certainly, I think, didn't think that, you know, they were trying to mine some fundamental faculty that would disclose to one, you know, fundamental truths about the nature of, say, moral obligation. Rather, they would be quick to say, well, clearly it's not a matter of common sense because there's so much disagreement about what the nature of a moral obligation is, and so on, to go back to Andrea's remark. So yeah, and in English, of course, we talk about people lacking common sense, redeemably sometimes, and irredeemably on other occasions. So I just really inviting you to sort of comment on that difference.
My sense is that my sense is that in English, when we talk about common sense, first, I mean, I think Kant would classify it some more as like a theoretical capacity, right? So, or is that right? If not merely if not just theoretical, then more empirical, right? So we might sort of say, well, of course, you know, that was the outcome of your action. It's sort of a matter of common sense that people are going to act that way, or sort of if you're trying to figure out the sort of right tool to use to put something together, you might say, well, just look at the thing. Common sense tells you you need, you know, a Phillips head screwdriver or something like that. So I think very often it's like we're appealing to some kind of theoretical capacity to sort of notice obvious things and put two and two together or something like that, or sort of notice features of human behavior and draw the kind of obvious conclusion from them. I think that's often what we mean by common sense. I don't think that's what Kant means. I mean, I think it's also highly empirical, as you were saying, right? So we sort of, one thing we do when we're trying to assess what's a matter of common sense is sort of ask the audience or take a poll. And then if there's disagreement, we say, well, I guess that's not as much of a matter of common sense as we thought. And so there's a sense in which we're kind of just seeing what people agree upon, or seeing what is sort of taken for granted by a community. And I think that's also not what Kant has in mind. I think, you know, Thomas is right. There's something more having to do with your sort of starter kit, as it were, your sort of very basic. And then there's a reason that it's shared. There's a reason that it's common in the sense that it's really foundational and basic. But it's not the kind of thing that may be empirically discoverable by taking a poll, or nor is it the thing necessarily. I think that it's just sort of and I do think that when we talk about common sense, you know, on reflection, it's when in English anyway, we're sort of talking about sort of a capacity to notice things, to notice connections between things, to notice sort of results of actions, to draw conclusions, more than we are talking about just a capacity to sort of assent to some kind of principle or something like that.
Thank you. I mean, there is a shared element in a kind of what's there pre-philosophically, as it were, to work with, and just maybe the different philosophical sensibilities from sort of an Anglo-American broadly empiricist approach to things, and a Kantian approach, you know, distinguishes the amount one might, or the degree to which one can find material to work with pre-philosophically. Kant's got a much richer conception of what might be there to draw out. Anyway, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.